Nick and I and Mitch and the CSRC want to thank everyone for taking the time this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, to join us in, I guess, which is our second informed consent breakout sessions. We started this, as everyone probably knows, about a year ago at the CSRC meeting just before COVID took over everything. And it took a little while, frankly. Nick and I sort of took up this added on working group about the issues of informed consent and trials with shock. And it really did take us a long time. It was sort of an amorphous concept about, what we were even trying to do and how we should even do it. And it took us a fair amount of time to sort of circle in on what we thought were the key points. It'd be nice to blame, I suppose, COVID for the relative delay in that, but I don't think that's necessarily true. It just took a long time for stuff to coalesce. And I think that's where we are right now, which is why we're having this. We've sort of drilled down after bringing in a lot of the experts and folks with experience, so many of whom are on this call. We got a lot of input over the past year, and we've drilled down on what we think are the main issues moving forward to come up with something that isn't just another way of saying, gosh, informed consent is hard, what are we going to do? Really trying to sort of move things forward in a generic sense that can then be applied specifically with to use the word deliverables. So with that, Nick is maybe going to start by sort of reviewing where we started in more detail, where we are, what we're hoping for today. I'm going to give like another iteration of a review primer of the regulations, the laws with informed consent, and then maybe Mitch can just make a couple comments about sort of the path forward that we're looking for to coming out of this mini think tank. So Nick, I'll throw it to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Simon, I don't know if you got my slides in time. If not, I can share them from my computer. Do you have them?
I do. If you'll just give me a second, I'm going to pull them up.
Sure. Sorry they arrived so late.
No, you're fine. I'm going to try to get everything set up so you guys can. Let me move this out the way. All right, let me know once you can see the screen.
Thanks very much. And just to echo John's thoughts, thank you very much everyone for joining us today. And thanks to everybody, probably too numerous to mention, that have helped us along this journey. As John said, it's taken a while to kind of coalesce our thoughts, but I'm glad we are hosting this mini think tank today with 3 breakouts that we hope will focus our minds on the path forwards, and Mitch will go into that in a bit more detail. Can we go to the next slide, please? I should disclose, I'm supposed to do this every time I speak, I am employed by Abbott Vascular, but obviously we are interested in this space because we have the PHP device, but I don't think there's any real conflict of interest particularly. Next slide, please. So John will go into this in a lot of detail, but I don't need to tell anyone on this call why the issue of informed consent for shock is important. It's important anyway, but it's particularly important for research purposes, and John will go into this, as I say, in a lot more detail. It is, though, as we've said before, a technical and legislative minefield in the US, owing to the common rule and, of course, the EFIC rules. But I will leave that for John in the next section, who will go into it in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. So I guess by way of context, we were put into this position. Where do we go? There are problems with cardiogenic shock research. As you know, everyone knows that the trials that have been performed in this space, whilst they've generated immensely useful data, not that much of it has been truly actionable or necessarily broadly applicable to the kind of patients we see. There, of course, are the issues with the emergency setting and consenting patients. There's the practicality of gaining consent in that context, the extent of being informed, and of course, there is the concept of risk, as in sometimes physicians are, if you like, their internal voice will tell them they have to do something rather than not do something, which may hamper the conduct of a clinical trial into a potentially helpful therapy, but may dilute the effect. So next slide, please. So we've come to this, and this was really the summary slide that I showed last time we met our mini think tank at SkyShock. Clearly, all of these stakeholders are very important in the process. We've talked about the way that shock networks operate, and they obviously would be a very important part of actioning clinical trials in shock. But of course, in order to get to that point, we need to somehow get IRB involvement, and there's been a lot of discussion, and one of the breakouts today will be about the role or potential role of a centralized IRB. There are proponents and there are opponents of this thought, and maybe even we need to not think about a centralized IRB approach, but maybe some centralized repository, if you like, of experience, expertise, and knowledge in this regard, which can be helpful. Of course, there are many other interested parties. We've got the NIH and FDA listed here, but there are other international parties that might also be interested if we're thinking about trying to harmonize the way we do things with other investigators, other countries where studies are being performed. And we think in particular about the difficulties that some of our European colleagues have had with the cross-border problems and the different regulatory authorities there that have hampered cooperation, if you like. And then, of course, we've got the whole thought of, how do we go about getting consent? And without wishing to reinvent the wheel, we've had some excellent advice from a variety of stakeholders, including networks who have wrestled with the issue of short form consent, and also from the ethical point of view about the use of surrogates for consent, deferred consent, and all that sort of thing. But again, more of that a bit later on in one of the breakouts. Then next slide, please. So these are the breakouts. The first breakout we have planned is if you like, the role of the centralized IRB or centralized repository of expertise, and whether that is a necessity. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? The second one really is to look at a skeleton outline of consent, and if you like, a tiered approach. And if we think of this, and I think Mitch will probably speak to this a bit when he says a few words a bit later on, what we're thinking here is that, of course, there will not be one size fits all. And the kind of approach that we take to an individual patient is not only dependent on perhaps the nature of their presentation. It may be that, for example, acute decompensated heart failure patients may be able to give advanced directives in terms of consent for clinical trials. They also may not be perhaps quite so in extremis as patients with AMI shock, but of course, there's a huge overlap there, and there will be very sick patients with ADHF, and likewise, there will be some patients with AMI shock who are perhaps less obtunded at the time. But so it's a question of, can we generate some way of either providing a framework that allows patients who can be consented to be consented, and those who can't be consented to either have surrogate consent or perhaps use the EFIC route. And again, this is a very difficult area and something that we'd like to talk about a lot more. And finally, the third breakout is considering these other stakeholders that I've mentioned, and also the business of international harmonization to really try and approach shock in a truly international fashion. Next slide, please. So just a brief word on each of them. The centralized IRB I've mentioned, or it doesn't have to be an IRB, it could be a repository of knowledge and expertise. Why would we want it? In summary, it has worked well in some emergency research settings. It does avoid repeated local clearances and differing queries. And we can argue about this. It may decrease the time to enrollment for trials. However, and it's a big however, it doesn't take into account local community and regional variations, which can be very, very important, especially now in the 21st century, regarding patient engagement, inclusivity, and diversity inclusion within clinical studies. Next slide, please. The second breakout, and I do apologize to Neil Dykert, who's on the call, for shamelessly stealing this slide of his. This sort of talks about the various options for consent process. And you go from, if you like, at the top, which is standard consent, fully informed consent from patient or surrogate, which is what we would do for any elective procedures, right down to the bottom where you have EFIC as default, where the patient basically is not involved at all. And between those two, we have context-specific consent process for full informed consent and EFIC with involvement. One thing I should also mention about going back to the tiered nature of consent, we may also need to tier it for the kind of study that people are being enrolled for. Is it an approved device against another approved device? Is it an unapproved device against standard therapy? There may be different tiers of consent required for those sorts of approaches. Next slide, please. Of course, the thought is that, well, why don't we just use EFIC for everything? And again, this is Neil's slide. It doesn't always play so well, and people don't want to have any kind of choice taken out of their hands, nor do their relatives or their surrogates. Next slide, please. So I think this is where we landed last time we spoke. It's somewhere between 2 and 3, probably, either a context-specific research process or EFIC with involvement, or if we can achieve it, some sort of hybrid that will be 0.2, 0.5, somewhere between those two. Next slide, please. So the final breakout will be the other stakeholders, and I've highlighted them in red over to the right. There may be many more than these. Other societies may also be interested, national associations, but also in the interest of international harmonization. Next slide, please. So how does this all fit together? Mitch has coined this phrase, the matrix. How do we put this all together? And I hope that after we've had the breakouts, we'll all be able to come together and consider how we synthesize these outputs, consider the context, the nature of the study that's being proposed, and the presentation of the patient, the state of the patient, the risk involved, etc., to try and hatch a way forward. So that's really a very brief overview, I think, of where we've been and where we've come to. John, I think now is going to talk a bit more about the legal aspects before handing on to Mitch and the breakouts. But again, once again, I'd like to thank everyone else who has contributed to where we've been from and where we've come to. It's been a very interesting journey, and it started off very amorphous, but I think we are slightly better focused now. So John, let me hand on to you. You're on mute, John.
Like I said, I'm not, as I was saying, I'm not a Zoom guru, so let me see if I can share this. Okay. And start this.
So John, under share, you may need to select the PowerPoint. There you go. And do you have 2 screens up? Because we're
I'm going to change that now. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks. Again, that was a great overview that Nick gave, and I'm going to just talk about something quite dry, and it's repetitive because I've said this many times at the CSRC discussions and elsewhere. Some of the hard facts, if you will, and the purpose, to have the repetition. If it's good for multiplication tables, maybe it's good for informed consent discussions as well, but it's just so that everyone's sort of dealing with the same basic understanding and the same facts, no alternative views of what is or isn't allowed by the law, at least in the US. So I'm going to race through these, and hopefully it'll add some guardrails to what we discuss in the breakouts. So informed consent in the US, there's a discrete policy. It's called the Common Rule, and just by nature of the name, you can tell it's a pretty comprehensive overview of the protection of human subjects. It involves all research in the United States, so it's not just IDE studies. It's all research, and the definition of that, of what research is itself very, very expansive. Anything with generalizable knowledge falls under Common Rule, and then informed consent is required for all research. So it's pretty much any sort of studies being done. Within the Common Rule, there are these quite specific requirements for what informed consent needs to contain, and small font, lots of pages, so that it's comprehensive. What is allowed by the Common Rule is exemption. So there's that first word here, exemption, and that's where pretty much you can think of it, and I'm willing to be corrected by other experts from the FDA who are here, but you can kind of think of it as not needing consent because it's of such a character that you don't need the institutional review board, the IRB, or even FDA to come in and say you need to get consent. But this is while it's a long list of exempted research, it's pretty specific, and it's really quite benign. It's secondary research, de-identified data. So this exemption does not apply to shock. It's unequivocal. Then there's this ability for the IRBs to waive certain aspects of the consent or alter certain aspects of the informed consent. And they have the prerogative, the IRBs have the prerogative to do this if the determination is made that it won't adversely affect the rights of the subjects in the research. It does allow for gaining information after subjects have been part of the study. There are some times where identifiable patients can be used. And most importantly, with shock, it's the idea is that you would allow waivers or alterations if it's just not practical to carry out the study without doing so, that the requirements get in the way of actually doing the study. So that sounds like, okay, that's shock. The problem is it only is applicable to research that involves no more than minimal risk. And in shock, even it's not relative minimal risk. It's not the comparison of doing something versus the outcomes of shock left untreated or left unstudied. It's the intervention itself. And by definition, pretty much anything with shock that involves research is going to involve more than minimal risk. So there is no ability for waivers or alterations of informed consent for shock. But the common rule has this in it, doesn't want to limit the ability to provide emergency care. So there's an inherent conflict there. And for trials, FDA then goes on and does carve out two exceptions to the common rule for informed consent for emergency devices that are being studied under investigational device exemption. So we can get back to a little bit of this conundrum, but basically in order to have an exception, which we'll get into in a second, it actually has to be under an IDE study. And I'm just going to backtrack a little bit here to review when an IDE is even necessary. And the IDE, as everyone I think at this point understands, it's an exemption itself from misbranding. It's a non-marketed study. So it involves new, and we're talking about devices here, but the same concept would apply to drugs as well. It's a new device or a new intended use of an already approved and marketed device. And you can see what the purposes of the IDE. It allows FDA to do its job of determining safety and effectiveness. And in this fashion, it has to go through institutional review board. And if it's a significant risk, if it's a study of a significant risk device, it has to go through FDA approval. And just like shock is always no risk, devices addressing shock are always going to be significant risk devices. So a study of a significant risk device, for the most part, is going to require an IDE that both the institutional review boards and FDA have a say in. And it's not a question of whether there are or not marketing plans for the device. That said, it's not to say that every time there's an IDE study, the FDA has to get involved, because if the device or devices, if it's two devices being compared to each other for the comparative outcomes, if those devices are being used in accordance with their already approved label, if they're already approved marketed devices, FDA doesn't have to sign off on the IDE. Similarly, if it's a foreign study, if FDA does not have any regulatory power outside the United States. So a foreign study with a device that is potentially looking to be marketed does not have to have FDA involvement. With the foreign studies, though, even though the default is if it's being conducted in the US, you need an IDE. If it's not in the US, you don't need an IDE. I'll just point out that FDA does require when it comes to consent and other things, but we're talking about consent here, that the consent process really has to rise to the level of what the regulations and the requirements for the common rule and FDA rules would be if the study were conducted, research were conducted in the United States. So keep that in the back of the mind when we're discussing the ability to have harmonization between US and outside US trials and research. Okay, so back to the exceptions to the common rule. There are two. The first one is sort of the individual use of, we won't talk about. That's basically where the investigator says, I have this investigative device and I just need to use it this one time. What we're talking about is exception is the other word, from informed consent, EFIC, otherwise known as in FDA parlance 5024, which is the part of the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, where this is spelled out. It involves protocolized research of a life-threatening situation where the individual is not able to give informed consent. And this is a bit of a sticking issue that we have to discuss as one of the breakout sessions topics is, how does one make that assessment of when you're allowed to actually give informed consent, able rather to give informed consent. And I'll just point out the last bullet item is that there really does have to be a prospect of direct benefit. So, snake oil is not going to be allowed to have an EFIC or 5024 study. And importantly, it's not a waiver. It's not hand waving away the requirements. There's a lot to it, and we'll be discussing this, and people who have been through this will give their perspectives on it. It's a big lift to do an EFIC study. There's community consultation, public disclosure of information, lots of documentation, and follow-up work with consent. So, I think we can all agree, if we're talking about shock, cardiogenic shock, the research is sort of emergency research because, it's timely intervention is required. But we also can agree that cardiogenic shock is very heterogeneous. It's a spectrum, and Mitch will probably talk about this with this it spans a lot, right? You can have, I give some examples there where, you might be able to get consent reasonably, and it truly could be informed, sort of a more chronic type of shock presentation. Or the other one I use being a surgeon is the post-cardiotomy cardiogenic shock, where someone can step out of the OR and speak to the legally authorized representatives, say we've got a problem here. But then there's the patient who oftentimes is what we think about, the patient coming in with an acute STEMI, obtunded or even unconscious, clearly that person cannot give consent. And if there's no one, a truly legally authorized representative available, and that too is something that's a little nebulous. How does one define the extents, the approaches to find that LAR? That sort of person cannot give consent. So not all research in shock is going to be 5024 EFIC research. And consequently, a lot of the shock ID trials will not qualify for 5024. So that's sort of where people say, throw up their hands like, oh, this is such a mess, we're never going to be able to move things along. And one thing we want to sort of discuss here is our sense, Nick, and the rest of the group's sense, working group sense is, it maybe isn't such an insurmountable challenge, that, perhaps it definitely doesn't. The consent form, the actual form, the process of getting consent does not need to be lengthy or complicated such that it gets in the way of patient therapy. The form itself does not need to be a standalone document. And you don't necessarily, if you're doing the multi-center IRB, have to have all the different IRBs with all their different inputs involved. Additionally, getting informed consent, it shouldn't necessarily be looked at as just like a hurdle to get over. It probably is beneficial if and when it can be done. It actually is a net win for everyone because the data set, as you can see there, I think is probably going to be a better data set. what someone makes the decision without the patient input is not necessarily going to be the same as what a patient really would want. There's a question of loss to follow-up if patients don't have that buy-in up front. And as I mentioned already, the EFIC requirements are not easy. They're not simple and they're not cheap. So EFIC, informed consent, get it or not, when it comes to shock, it's a very, it's an admixture of a lot of different concepts. It's not just the form. There are regulatory issues with dealing with IRBs and FDA if necessary. There are the issues with, these are just some examples of the different aspects of what you have to go through. From a legal standpoint, the common rule, it's a legal document. The United States and non-US localities will have different legal requirements. And if we're trying to do multinational or large trials, that has to be rolled into the consent process. Scientifically, if the consent process is defining the population, so for with STEMI, it's going to be, say, EFIC, and we're only going to take obtunded patients who are just clearly not able to give consent. Well, that's the studied population. That's going to affect labeling, and how that data set is collected from the study population can affect reimbursement decisions from CMS and then private insurers, and it can affect adoption by clinicians. So there are these downstream effects of legal, regulatory, scientific, and then finally, as everyone clearly understands, there's a lot of ethical issues here. One person's informed really should be the same as another person's definition of informed, and that's something hard to do. And finally, we don't want form to trump function, right? We're trying to move the individual patient's care forward and the research forward. So we don't want the consent form, to be so onerous that it limits that ultimate objective. So it sounds like, as I say, just throw up your hands and carry on the way you've been doing. We'd like to think that we're at the point that that's not necessarily the case, which is why we are bringing all you folks in to see if you agree on certain aspects of this. If people don't, if the feeling is that these certain aspects are just not able to be done, you can't, even as Nick says, we're not looking for one size fits all, but we want everyone to have the opportunity to pick what size is appropriate. If even that can't be done, okay, at least we've established that. But this is where we're starting from now. It's not an unsolvable problem. We've identified 3 aspects that we think are potentially parts of the solution, and we'll see how that pans out in the discussion groups. Okay. Mitch, anything to add?
Well, pretty good setups. You guys make the call. I have some comments prepared, but we are at 10:40. And I don't want to take too much time away from the breakout sessions.
So I think if you got a couple of comments to add, they'll help maybe focus a little bit the breakout session. So feel free. Why don't you take a little bit of time?
Yeah. So John, you have to stop sharing, please.
Oh yeah. Stop share.
Great. And let me try this. Does that look like slides?
Yes.
Yep, looks like slides.
Okay. So great job, great setup. This group inherited this from our last think tank, just in recognition that it was such a hair-tearing experience that for the whole group that we should dedicate a work group. And Nick and John have done a great job over the virtual past year to try and move this forward, as you've heard in their comments. So I've come back to this notion of the matrix really from the perspective of if you're planning a shock study, whether you're a manufacturer or a clinician, et cetera, what and how do you see this as a way of going forward that's not just a one-off solution for every single different clinical trial, but a potential groundwork for reusable solutions that would make multiple trials in this space more efficient. So I don't have to dive too deeply into this. I think informed consent has been a pain point in planning a study. We usually think about modes of failure, and certainly I think inability to enroll in shock studies is not uniquely a function of informed consent, but it certainly plays a role. Furthermore, the heterogeneity of how different IRBs see the ethical issues, different international jurisdictions, as was mentioned. The other thing I think it's important to recognize is, depending on how you solve the shock informed consent issue, we have the potential of, in the design of the trial, just by virtue of that decision, exempting or eliminating key patients who can't provide informed consent, who may and then fundamentally bias the cohorts that we collect and can report data on. So, and this is just, as everybody's indicated, tip of the iceberg. So I think we've heard in parts what really are sort of 5 operationally oriented or pragmatic contextual issues that to me are fundamental to the matrix: the acuity of the phenotype, the status of the patient and or legal representative, the applicability of regulatory or federal statutes, the ethical perspectives and oversight processes that go with any human subjects trial in this space. And then operationally, how would you put a shock informed consent together in this kind of matrix? And again, beginning with what we will end with, the tip of the iceberg. The acuity phenomena, obviously for ambulatory shock or a patient who's in hospital getting a Lasix infusion, or who's even in the ICU, stabilized on a circulatory support device, that's not what we're talking about here. These are all individuals who you have time to work with and talk. And irreversible futile settings we're also clearly not engaged with here. But the spectrum from acute shock syndromes like a STEMI shock and or acutely decompensating shock syndromes where you're on that skid where time is everything, this is where the ethical dimensions expand, as has been noted, to time delays that impact the reversibility are not ethically acceptable delays. So that's a big issue. And then the role for ethically fit to purpose approaches like abbreviated consent with later follow-up or EFIC has been pointed to. In terms of patient consciousness scenarios, even in a pretty decompensated, I mean, a patient with a blood pressure of 60 who looks gray and cold may still be awake and alert. So awake and alert who's stable, awake and alert who are decompensating, if the patient's confused and unconscious but a family member is present, or there's no family member on the scene and the patient is not compos mentis, this again is the spectrum of where we are wrestling with something that's not a classical informed consent process. And this again is where I think ultimately what's really fit to purpose for research in this space is going to have to be a hybrid of abbreviated consent and or complete exemption from informed consent, depending on where they are in this kind of a spectrum. And again, I think it's really important to keep in mind and to remind all authorities involved that if we don't address this full spectrum with consent approaches and solutions, then we are fundamentally going to be performing and designing clinical trials that provide flawed benefit risk evidence relative to the actual clinical practice and public health needs for treating shock and advancing better, safer devices to help us treat shock. The statutory regulations John elegantly walked through, and again, the scenarios I think that matter here are wherever we have to address randomized trials or other between approved devices that are federally funded between approved devices that may be looking for labeling extension or not. And obviously, if it's a PMA for an investigational device. And this is where I think we really have to pay attention to what do the statutes say and how can they be interpreted, because I think rewriting regulations or statutes, at least for outcomes in at least my lifetime, is not a viable path. So somewhere in here, we have to really focus, as John pointed to in a couple of settings, the degree to which we can look at the letter and the spirit of the existing regulations and feel like we're working within the relevant regulations, but through interpretive means. The ethical perspectives are really where the crisscrossing occurs. Patients and families clearly want and deserve a voice in research participation, and we have to guard that protection of their rights, but without doing harm. So there's a bit of a conundrum built into that if time can shift the spectrum of outcomes. This can include community perspectives or individual approaches. The other types of delays for classical in-depth informed consent are not okay as a trade-off to shift somebody from a salvageable to a non-salvageable outcome. Similarly, elimination of patients who can't provide informed consent is not okay if we are really focused on gathering interpretable and generalizable evidence on device benefit risk in the most fragile patients of all, many of whom are so sick they can't speak for themselves, and they may not have a family member right there. Furthermore, I think to understand where these ethical perspectives are in play, ethical oversight has got to be something deeper than we've had previously for shock studies. And whether that's an independent repository for ethical review that has expertise in this, or selected central IRBs who are willing to develop expertise in these particular issues, those are potential alternatives going forward that could really impact on this complex and dialectical ethical perspective. Operationally, then, finally, we really need a way to deliver what has to be delivered if we're going to have a portfolio of options that include exemption from informed consent. But the characteristics of how to do that consistently and with high quality are similar to why we now have shock teams, in my impression, and my opinion. Shock teams now are widely used to quickly identify patients with shock and triage them according to the etiology. In the setting of acute decompensated cardiogenic shock, we're going to need clearly defined parameters for applying a fit-to-purpose hybrid informed consent methodology within a single trial. And it's going to be up to the shock network sites to operationalize time-sensitive processes and be able to deliver this according to where that fit-to-purpose establishes is the cutoff along the way. Site networks also provide a means to include patients, families, and communities in focused educational efforts to help understand where, when, under what circumstances, and why we would have a range of options that include exemption from informed consent in this life-threatening setting. So in conclusion, a phenotype focus for today's discussion, I think, would probably be something like acute decompensated. We've been falling back to, I think, relevantly, to not go sideways, to acute STEMI shock. And in that setting, safeguarding patient and family preferences for research participation are essential to well-designed shock studies, but requiring processes with time delays that risk making a patient's outcome worse or not salvageable is not okay. That is not ethically acceptable. And going onwards without being able to create cohorts that actually reflect our public health needs and research needs is also not okay. We can't just kick this downstream. We need a solution. So efficient, reusable hybrid strategies that include well-defined rapid classifications of patient status with some stable repository of experience and wisdom for ethical oversight is going to be, I think, what we really potentially could tip from talking about to applying in 2021 to industry studies, to startup registries, to ongoing registries, to the shock world that will make a real difference in the quality, interpretability, and generalizability of the evidence that we can collect. So from there, sounds like we have a good bit to talk about.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mitch. So I guess what we're going to do is, as Mitch said, we ran a little bit over, so probably plan for these breakout sessions to last to, let's say, noon Eastern time. And then we can reconvene as a larger group after that and basically get some reports from what was discussed at the individual groups, because obviously everyone won't be able to split themselves into three to be all in all three groups. So Serena, how do we go to the breakout groups? I'm once again showing my Zoom naivete.
Well, we're gonna do this together. You all are assigned breakout groups based on how you registered. If you did not pick a breakout room, you'll automatically be assigned to one. So in about a minute, you'll all go to your breakout rooms, and then at noon, you'll get a ping that it's closing.
Samia,
And
just before we break, Samia, if you would walk people through, if for some reason you really get popped into the wrong room, you can go back to the main and get reassigned. Is that correct? Or
Yeah,
Samia,
yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, Mitch. The main room is still open, which is this room. So if you go to the wrong room or you want to go to a different room, you can come back here and we can reassign you. All right. See everybody soon.
Looks like I got sent to the wrong room. Can you send me to breakout number 3?
The harmonization group.
Yeah, correct.
Let me see. Hey, Alpha, how can I remove, what group were you in?
I went to Ian's group, the central, I went to Ian Gilchrist's group.
Okay.
You should be able to either, if you click on his name, you should be able to just send him into the other room. Or
Perfect. All right, you're going to be moving over, Sean.
Okay.
Thanks, Alpha.
Yep. And I'm about to admit somebody who's in the waiting room too. So
Hi, Graham. What group would you like to go to? And what group were you in? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Now that I better understand the process, I was in one, but I think I would be more useful in 2.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks. Sorry.
No,
Santina,
you're
can I be assigned to group 2, please?
Carlos to group 2. Yep.
Yes, please. Thank you.
And that is templates. Oh wait, I think I put Graham in the wrong one. Poor Graham. He's gonna be like, why are you moving me to the wrong places, Graham? Oh no, he's in the right place. God bless. Okay.
all right, looks like everybody's in. Phew.
Thank you, Alpha. Oh my God, I've never done the breakouts before. I've always been like assigned to a breakout as a facilitator, but didn't have to assign people. So it's been kind of stressful.
Now, do all the breakout rooms have somebody that's going to record?
Yes. Please be sure to record. And as co-hosts, they can do that, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. There's a lot of people that didn't sign up. So, hey, Bindi, what group would you like to go to?
Yeah, I'm in the wrong group. Can I enter the harmonization group?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I feel like an operator, like back in the 50s. Let me connect you.
Yeah.
So wait, at 11 you have another meeting, or you're leaving for the day? I hope
Yeah, I'm taking a half day today, so I won't even be by a computer.
Yeah, don't be by a computer. Please.
But I'm
I feel like half days are sometimes the only way to get a break sometimes, because taking a full day seems like too much work, if that makes any sense.
Yep, it does. I try to do, like, for this year, I want to do like as many half days Fridays that I can, because it's so rejuvenating just to have just a little bit of a break and do something else. So I love it.
All right, so I really love the people that are in the breakouts, like Dave and Ian and Ileana. Like, they're super chill. They're just they're like, Ileana and Ian are like, yeah, I'm not doing slides. Like, do I have to do slides? I'm like, no, you don't. You're like, I'd rather just do without. And I'm like, this is why I love you. And then Dave does have slides, but he's like, I want to write my own notes and I want to monitor my own chat. If you can just advance my slide, would that be okay? And I'm like, of course, Dave. Like, we usually do all three, so that's fine. So he's great. But you are free, Alpha, to log off now. I think I have a good handle of what's happening, and I'll try not to text you. So I just stay here and close all the rooms.
Yeah, so you probably want to do a broadcast message when it's going to be time to go.
Like a 5-minute
yeah,
message, and then a 1 minute.
Yep.
Well, I have a 1 minute warning set up. So we'll see
So the 1 minute warning will go off. For the broadcast message, just put in the message and say broadcast to all, and it'll flash quickly in all the rooms, whatever the message is. So you could say, hey, we got 5 minutes left or whatever. And then that's pretty much it. It looked like in your settings, you had already set it to automatically end in 90 minutes. So there's nothing you have to do. 90 minutes, everybody will get logged out. And
and I reset it. Yeah, and I reset it to 70 minutes since we started at 10:50.
Okay.
So it should close automatically. But I'll just stay in here unless somebody screams. And it looks like Dawn is also logging off, but Ian probably won't need her for anything.
Okay. Yeah. So in this room, that's great. The only, if somebody needs help, then it's a good idea to just like maybe ping one of the other co-hosts and tell them to jump into that room. So someone's always in this room.
Okay. I'll stay in here. Yeah, that's a good point.
All right. Good luck. And
Alpha.
no problem. Feel free to text if you need anything, but I will be going off of mind memory of where to find things. So have a great weekend though, and good luck with the meeting.
Thank you.
No problem. Bye.
Hi, Kevin. We're currently in breakout rooms. Which breakout room would you like to be assigned to? We have Central IRB.
Oh, I apologize. I was on mute. Thank you very much. I think I might have been sent to the wrong group. I'm supposed to be in the informed consent group.
Okay, I will move you over there. Let's see.
Took me a while to figure out how to get to home here. I'm sorry. I'm not.
Which group were you in? Oh, so you were in group 3 and you want to go to group 2. Okay.
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, Patrice. Hello, Patrice. What group would you like to join for the breakout sessions? I have Central.
Yeah, I thought I had asked for stakeholders and wherever you think I can be most helpful. I'm really there to listen. So I'm glad to.
Yeah, I'm going to move you to stakeholders.
All right, sounds great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And Kevin, make sure that you accept the invitation to move.
Okay, yeah, nothing's come up yet.
Okay, and you said Central or
No, no.
Central IRB?
No, please inform consent.
Oh, yeah, so it says that it's moved you there, but that you've not joined.
I didn't get a please join.
Okay, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to move you out of group 2 and then back into it and see if that works.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. And then, okay, let's see if that works. Did you get a notification now?
Nope. Is it buried somewhere in amongst all these icons, or should it pop up as like a dummy
It should
message?
pop up that you're being moved. Maybe, I don't know if this will help, but maybe closing Zoom and then coming back in, and I'll reassign you to group 2.
Okay, then I'm going to leave the meeting and log back in.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what's happening.
Not a problem. Thank you.
All right. Joining. All right. I'm going to assign to ICF templates. All right, Kevin, sending you over. Hi there. Preston, correct? I have that you will be going to the ICF templates breakout. They just started about 15 minutes ago, so you'll probably be joining when they're still doing introductions.
Oh, that's fine. I had a conflicting meeting this morning, so I had to come in late. I'm sorry to be a late
No,
arrival.
no. We're really glad that you can join and give your perspective. So you'll be moving over now to, what would I say, ICF templates with Dave Morrow.
Okay.
Hi, Paul. Welcome. I don't have a breakout session for you, and breakout started a few minutes ago. Which breakout session would you like to join? Central IRB, ICF templates, or harmonization of stakeholders? I think you're muted. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Sorry about that. I can wait till the next session too, which is.
Oh no, they just started. So
Okay.
you'll be joining in as they're just doing discussion.
Perfect.
They still have an hour to go.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Which group would you like to go in?
Oh, the harmonization.
Harmonization. Gotcha. Yep. I'll be sending you over now.
Thanks.
Hey there, Alistair. I'm moving you over to Central IRB. Mike. Which group would you like to be sent to? I think you're muted. We have central IRB, ICF templates, and harmonization. I'm sorry, I still can't hear you. Are you able to unmute now? Let's see. I think I might, let me see if I can. Registrants. Hey, Chris, which group would you like to go to?
Oh, hey, thank you so much. Can I try group 3?
Yeah,
Group 2 has been fantastic, but I'd also like to hear what's going on in group 3.
Absolutely. That's the whole fun of this. Okay,
so
let
much.
me, yeah, let me move you over now. Mike, let's see. Let me see if I can find where you were. Mike, I'm gonna, oh, harmonization. Okay, perfect. I am moving you over. Sorry, I don't know why I can't hear you either, but I'm moving you into group 3 shortly. Group 3. Hey, Tim, what group would you like to be moved over to? I think you're muted again. Group 1 or 2? You can also put in the chat which group you'd like to go into if you're not able to unmute yourself.
It's like Star Trek being zapped from one spot to another.
I know that some groups have a lot to still that they want to discuss, but we can continue discussions in this forum as well.
Looks like we're back.
Yep. Just give a little bit of time here to see if everyone, I guess, looks like the numbers are pretty much everyone, all the things are back. So
I gave everybody a bio break for about 5 to 7 minutes between.
Okay. Dave kept us going in group 2, right to the.
No mercy, hard work.
That's right. That's right. Anyway, thanks very much. I was in with Dave's group in the second, template comprehensive consent process discussion. Nick had to step away for a second to put out a little emergency. Not a shock, but some emergency. So he'll be back in a little bit. And so perhaps what we can do is, I mean, it's a little hard to recoalesce here and sort of regurgitate for the group as a whole what was discussed in the individual breakout sessions. But that said, maybe try to give the highlights to the other people so that everyone's on the same page. So in that respect, maybe we'll go in order of the group numbers. If Ian and folks from your the central IRB and obviously a lot of these things spill over into one another. In our group, we actually broached central IRB, but maybe you can just sort of share what that group 1 came up with or didn't come up with, or any comments that you want to share with the group as a whole.
Well, we solved all the problems.
Excellent.
And then, of course, found a whole new slug of problems. So we're back to where we started from. I think the consensus, or the unanimous consensus, was essentially that the central IRB approach is the best approach. And to the point that if we're doing shock trial type things, it almost should be a prerequisite to be involved in that trial, that you're using the central IRB, not only one for, from past experience that we heard, where the more they use the central IRB, the more they like the central IRB because of the challenges in that the central IRB could help with making the local IRBs much more comfortable. The other thing is that there's a cost to using a central IRB, and that cost, at least in the present design of central IRBs, is more of a fixed cost per trial rather than necessarily a per site cost. So if a central IRB is going to charge a trial $100,000 and only half your sites are going to use it, then half your sites are accounting for $100,000. Whereas if all your sites are using it, that same $100,000 cost is spread over the whole system. Also, amendments, changes, this and that go much more efficiently through a trial to do that. The other area that we sort of skidded on a little bit was who is going to be reviewing these sort of shock protocols. Certainly, a lot of people that are actively doing shock trials might be considered conflicted by being on a central group that's in some people's minds, maybe rubber stamping trials that maybe should have had a different perspective put on it. And who's going to sort of brand these people as being the people to review these things? Like who's, it's not like an AHA stamp or an ACC stamp or, a good housekeeping stamp. Who's going to vet these people? That type of detail, we pushed around, but adds another dimension to it. Mike Weisfeld pointed out in his experience, they used a particular IRB that had a lot of shock experience, and that sort of grew into the central IRB for his research consortium, so to speak. And that worked out well for them when he did that. Question would be, in those circumstances, would outsiders look at that and say, well, they're all in cahoots with each other? Is that protecting patients or not? And on the other hand, they did have a central IRB that knew their stuff and knew what was happening and knew what was going on. But I think the concept was it might make the most sense to have, a good shock trial or a good shock network that wants to do research should be willing to work with the central IRB as a prerequisite to join the club, so to speak. That central IRB then would provide a basis of expertise to be able to look at shock trials, look at shock amendments, look at whatever to then give honest appraisal, honest, look at this. Now this doesn't, we still need local community support. There's certain aspects depending on the spectrum of the trial where if you're doing a trial that needs community input, that's something a central IRB would have a difficult time being part of. On the other hand, the central IRB may have interesting ideas or concepts of how to get community support. Like we heard about an automated phone system that called people in the past. Now, today I think my phone would just block it all, but have people been successful with social media, this and that? Those types of what works today and now is an expertise that a central group could help with, so local communities can then decide what may make sense. Because I'm a local guy here in central Pennsylvania, but I can't tell you what the best way is to reach out to my community, or I really could use with some ideas of how to do that. But that was some of the thoughts we had. Other guys want to jump in here? I don't want to occupy all the airwaves. We also heard some international perspective too, which they all were much more towards a centralized body that gave guidance to the local sites. And it seemed like that was working for them. It's just the US is for so long as, rights start with the individual, and to anything that goes beyond the individual or the local or the IRB out to more of a national thing always gets certain people's hair standing up on end. A lot of guys here with their tongues tied, and a few women too.
So I ask you, while people untying their tongues, what about, say, if it were purely industry-sponsored trials? Any particular industry-focused input on the yays or nays for central IRB? Hello?
Well, I mean,
there.
I think that a lot of it's going to be moot, right? Because there's going to be requirements for central IRBs in the future increasingly. Perhaps not every trial, but currently anything that has any NIH sponsorship, and in the near future anything that's regulated by the common rule. So I think that it's really a question of how to make it work as well as possible, and what advantages you can get out of it and what disadvantages you can minimize, rather than whether or not. There might be an opportunity for some industry sponsored studies to avoid a central IRB in the future, but I think it's going to be limited.
So this may be begging, and I don't know if you guys dove into or not, or Robert, the notion of working with sites who are already collaborating as a shock network, who are already aligned to certain modalities of working together, that a central IRB would have efficiencies. I honestly don't think the financial issue is going to be the big deal, because frankly, if the efficiency alone takes 3 months off a trial for a commercial entity, 3 months of earlier market entry is a whole lot more than an extra $100,000 or whatever. So I think
there's no guaranteed efficiency from a central IRB or a single IRB.
Right. It's not guaranteed.
You can use a single IRB and get very messed up.
Well, so point taken, but certainly that is equally true if you have multiple IRBs. So I think we have vicissitudes both ways. I think, and again, a central IRB doesn't have to be one central IRB for a whole study. If one central IRB brings 20 sites who are already connected, contracts are established, et cetera, and another central IRB, they can be regional central IRBs. Or so I wouldn't take this as a one-dimensional construct, but a way of creating efficiencies. The other thing that we talked about briefly in our group, but I mentioned up front as well, is anywhere we can create a single ethical oversight entity that is independent and recognizable, that actually has experience working with the ethical dilemmas of shock study designs, and is experienced with regulations both from FDA and OHRP, et cetera, there's going to be another level of efficiency and even insight that potentially could be guided by developing an IRB or a network of regional IRBs or whatever who have shock study experience. So we don't have to start over with every single new study.
So Ian, one quick question. Maybe it's one of the the new problems that you came up with. Who if there's buy-in for this concept of a central IRB, as Mitch just described, doesn't have to be one, grand body, and there's concern about who's actually, with conflicts of interest. What did you guys, other than pointing out this important aspect, was there any discussion about what might be done to, as you say, certify it, get a seal of approval, such as it were? I mean, is this something that the society should be involved with? Certainly central IRBs are, been used, with siren networks and other studies. So, and with NIH, right? What did you discuss this at all, or have any thoughts about it?
I think we recognized it, so we discussed it. I don't think we came back with a firm answer, other than we need to recognize that there may be a problem, because many cardiogenic shock trials aren't that common in the big realm of all the research trials going on, there's a modest number of people that have an expertise in this area. And at least on a clinical basis, many of those are already involved in cardiogenic shock research. So, you know, you can't be an expert unless you've got a conflict. And that's something that, you know, would need to be, you know, because there's all sorts of ethical landmines laying around this field. I think you want to make sure that all your fingernails are clean and no one says, oh, you had a bunch of, you had the gang all involved and they've just been rubber stamping these things. And you just sort of, you bulldozed over all these other side issues of ethical considerations, and you paid no attention to the risks because all you guys see are the benefits. And again, I don't know I don't know much about the central IRB, how you become a central IRB, what stamp of approval you get, or has this just been a survival of? Well, fortunately, I think in the U.S. there's only a handful of them, and it hasn't quite turned into a cottage industry where every metropolitan area has their own central IRB. So it hasn't balkanized yet, but it's just a point to be made that when you start to focus down onto one discrete area of interest, you need to watch out that you're not so discrete that you're going to have no one to oversee you who isn't already involved in the project. And that was one of our concerns with having, Dr. Weisfeld's idea of, a single site that already is very experienced doing it. I think that works in a controlled environment, but as you broaden out stuff, one, would that single site be willing to keep taking on all these shock trials, and two, will they be considered just part of the club and not get the respect that you need to make sure the local sites really understand that they're getting guidance from a central group that is respectful.
And Ian, we also discussed the importance of putting together the principles and the justifications and submitting that recommendation to a regulatory body such as FDA to endorse the concept of the importance of the application of a central IRB in this type of work. That doesn't address the specific issues that you raised right now to composition, expertise, imputed conflict, and all those other components. But it does, I think, provide a very important degree of support for the concept that will enable us at local levels to facilitate implementation of a central IRB concept.
I think we sort of thought that was a very important thought, is some sort of external acknowledgement that this is a good idea, and it's not just an investigator telling their IRB that this is a good idea, but that something to point to that this is the best way to go forward in other people's opinion.
Yeah, great. I think I saw somebody's trying to chime in there.
Yeah, this is thanks a lot. This is Tom Tadar. With the caveats that Ian mentioned, I certainly would agree that that's something to be concerned about, a club atmosphere. But that taken with a lot of respect, I would say that based on my industry and CRO and sponsor experience over the years, that without question, a central IRB in a trial such as this would be a very large asset for logistic purposes and everything else. Again, with the caveats that were mentioned, but dealing with multiple local IRBs, particularly at certain institutions that might be well known, often was a nightmare for a sponsor and for a CRO perspective. But again, the caveats that were expressed are certainly points that need to be respected, because that is a risk and a danger.
It's Graham Nickel. May I ask whether the problem you're trying to solve is lack of familiarity with the regulations and how to apply them, or is the problem multiple interpretations because of multiple IRBs?
Yeah, I mean, I think both, actually. I mean, familiarity with the regulations, familiarity with not so much with the disease entity, but also the expertise of who's going to be on the panel and so forth. So with the central IRB, generally it works out a little bit better from a logistic purpose, and again, with a lot of caveats, it's not always going to be like that.
I think
Yeah,
it's
I guess,
important to have some collective, or corporate is not the right word, given some studies are funded by industry and some not, but corporate memory of how to do this. And personally, I think that is more important than having a central IRB per se. To paraphrase what Rob Silberglide said, a central IRB constituted by people who have no knowledge of cardiogenic shock and no knowledge of the ethic regulations is not going to help.
No, obviously not. I mean, but all things being equal, assuming that the central IRB had that requisite knowledge and the background, it's just logistically easier to work with the central IRB than many local IRBs. But again, a lot of caveats involved, and one size doesn't fit all.
well, there are caveats, but I would, honestly, Graham, I would lean toward agreeing with Tom pretty strongly for any approach that's going to break new ground. And I think
No, I'm very supportive of that.
the likelihood that
No, I mean, I think what
trial that includes a hybrid approach where we're going to have definitions of what do we call someone who can or cannot provide informed consent. I mean, to make something go forward here and have 70 individual IRBs all review it, I think is much more likely to grind to a halt than if we could have 3 or 4 regional or whatever IRBs with whom full conversation could be engaged and hopefully then reused over time. So the experience and knowledge of the key features, regulations, ethical conundrums, etc., are not a full restart 70 different times.
Yeah, I'm not arguing for the status quo. I think knowledge is more important than centrality, but someone else was trying to offer their perspective.
No, so I think I saw, yeah, Robert, you want to talk?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that was really the point. The point Graham's making is the point I was trying to make, is that it matters who the central IRB is. So the idea of saying a central IRB versus local IRBs might miss the point. The point is that a single central IRB that is informed, that is educated, working with a network that has a good working relationship where you work on those processes and know each other, all of that is very important. The central IRB, just using a central IRB doesn't solve anything and might make things worse, but a central IRB that works well, that is right selected, that has the appropriate qualities is what you need. And
right, and I think that's definitely what when we talk about central IRB from
I think we could all agree on that. There's no question about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we can all agree on it, but I think it's worth stating because it's not the business model for a lot of commercial IRBs, for example, where their goals are on throughput and they just take it to whatever panel is next available, and you can, it's something we can all agree on, but it's worth really stating many times.
That's true.
Okay.
No question.
So I think we're running a little short on time because we've got the other 2 breakout sessions. So we'll maybe pivot to Dave Morrow and the second group, which was discussing the sort of nuts and bolts of the consent process, EFIC, non-EFIC, all those sorts of things. So Dave, want to begin by bringing everyone up to speed?
And then certainly you and Neil and Catherine and Graham should weigh in as well. I know Mitch will add. We were charged with whether we could formulate a generalizable informed consent process that would suit well for enrolling the clinical population that's relevant to our practice in shock, which has been challenging. because they're extremely heterogeneous, as Mitch pointed out in the beginning. And I think one of the key points our group started with is that there actually a lack of data, not zero data, but a lack of data to really guide us as to what truly respecting the patient as our central goal means in this circumstance. And there is some data to help guide the fact that patients do want to be engaged even when there is limited capacity for understanding the nuances of risk benefit in the middle of presenting with acute MI and cardiogenic shock. But still, there's a lot to learn, which makes it a little bit more challenging to make judgments about the best way to proceed. We spent the majority of our time talking about the appropriateness of EFIC for this trials in this population. And I think we discussed the fact that traditionally, the judgment about whether EFIC was appropriate for a trial was grounded in the proportion of the patients that might be eligible for the study and appropriate for the study who would not be able to provide consent. And if that proportion is on the order of even 20% or less, that might present some challenges for EFIC as an approach in the view of some constituents. We expanded that to recognize, though, there's a broader population with shock who, because of the severity of their disease, may not be able to participate meaningfully in the process, even though they may be awake, as Mitch pointed out in one of his earlier introduction. And I would say, and I welcome people to disagree and to voice other opinions from our group, but I would say at the end, we reached a consensus that to enroll the entire spectrum of shock patients that we think are relevant to clinical practice and scientifically important, that EFIC is an appropriate and important approach to consent. And it under EFIC allows for the whole gamut of inclusion of patients who are able to consent, including their legal authorized representative as well, whenever possible, and then ultimately always engaging the patient when they are able to participate as they hopefully recover from their shock. And so inherently, even in an EFIC approved trial, there is a whole spectrum that would be applied appropriate to the level of the patient's ability to participate. We also discussed the potential merits of having stratified randomization where patients who clearly were not able to consent might be randomized in one strata because that group also may be inherently different in other ways based on the severity of their shock presentation and whether there was merit in doing that and allowing for different processes. We also discussed the possibility of having parallel separate trials, and some still advocated for that, I think, at the end of our discussion. But at least I was among a few that voiced the opinion that creating more smaller trials in shock was not really consistent with our overall objective, where we probably have a need to have single definitive trials. That has been a struggle, and that stratified randomization within a trial like that may prove the best way of approaching it. I think those were really the most important elements of our conversation. We then also discussed EFIC and the actual implementation of EFIC. And I think those in our group, like Graham, who have done this, and Neil Dickert, who have the most experience, reflected back that there are well-trodden approaches to doing this, and that including the community engagement is certainly feasible. It is doable for multi-center studies, and that just as there are, particularly in cardiac arrest, where There's an aggregate experience that provides a sort of stable base of approaches and advice for people to engage the community. That can be done in shock as well. And so EFIC should not be viewed as a barrier to being able to conduct shock trials if there is a need. I will stop there and welcome others from our group to chime in. John, we'll let you take the chair's prerogative first, and then others, please.
Okay, so one thing I heard, maybe it's sort of reflecting, you hear what you want to hear, but one thing I thought I heard our group coming to agreement on was that the trials for shock, ought to start as EFIC trials, and that, ideally we shouldn't be designing trials that are just going to be focused on the intended person who can't give consent, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum where you may or may not, the gray zone, that the trials should be designed and executed to cover that phenotype, to use Mitch's word. Is that right, or am I sort of mischaracterizing what we said?
No,
Graham, may I respond to that?
Please, yeah, Graham, please.
I would just emphasize acute shock trials.
Yes, acute shock.
Yeah, I think I'll just, stipulate again, we all recognize that there are a spectrum of patients even, within acute shock, but also that, as Mitch introduced at the very beginning, there are a broad spectrum of chronicity of shock and different care environments where EFIC would not apply, certainly.
Yeah, I think, and to me, Catherine's comment during our discussion, which was very helpful, is to recognize that an EFIC study doesn't mean every patient has to be exempted from informed consent. As David said, EFIC just means that we can include those patients, and then to what degree patients can be consented acutely, or whenever they become awake and alert can be consented in a timely fashion. It's just a more flexible design. If we start with a predicate, which we, for discussion purposes, did, and insofar as trying to take this discussion from now to CRT in about a month, with an eye towards actual application in a study this year, to concentrate on, so what is the study that could accommodate acute STEMI cardiogenic shock in a patient who's unconscious and there's no family member immediately available? And then all of the levels that go backwards from there. So what if there is a family member available, or what if the patient is conscious, but they really don't seem to be perfusing very well? Or what if a patient is actually awake and alert, even though their blood pressure is 60? And walking backwards, starting with an EFIC study design. The main challenge I heard was that if the percentage of the population is not majority EFIC, that might meet with a sort of a statutory regulation question mark. But the answer to that question, it sounded to me like, and Catherine or anybody can correct me if I heard this wrong, is if this actually is a very high impact clinical subset of patients, even if they're 15% of the total acute STEMI shock denominator, if they're the 15% who represent a different level of illness or management, they're clinically important, that could justify taking an EFIC approach, even when the actual percentage of patients who would truly be exempted from informed consent was 20% or less.
So this is Catherine. I don't think I interpreted it that way, unless we're talking about the study design of doing two parallel identical studies where we can separate out that very different patient population. But maybe Kevin, if he has a different take on that, he can chime in.
Yeah, well, first of all, I should clarify there's no regulatory language wrapped around this, so it's all related to policy. And if you look at FDA guidance documents on this point, we do talk about how if the study could be conducted in consenting subjects and it would not unduly delay the conduct of the trial, we would expect it to be done in consenting subjects. However, there's another caveat that they talk about in the guidance, and that is that, let's see, I've got it in front of me. It says, if the results of obtaining the consenting subjects could be generalized to subjects who are unable to provide consent, we would expect it to be done in consenting subjects. Let me flip that around. Basically, what I mean is if the sponsor could provide a good argument that the study results done in consenting subjects could not be generalized to non-consenting subjects, there may be a good rational argument for including them in the ethics study, using it via ethic.
It's Graham. Can I ask you to clarify? My interpretation is the regulations do not specify a particular percentage of patients who are consentable. From what I recall, the phrasing is more whether obtaining informed consent is feasible within the therapeutic window.
Correct.
That's correct. Yes, the regulations do not spell out any percentages.
Sorry,
I
and,
think
and you've
I think
referred
this
a
is
couple
actually
times to prolonging the study. I mean, can I ask you to clarify again? Do you mean prolonging the time to obtain consent beyond the therapeutic window, or do you mean prolong the overall duration of study enrollment? Because my prior discussions with FDA have focused more on the former than the latter.
I don't know if I understand your question. Could you say it again?
Well, you've referred a couple times to the agency considering whether consent, a requirement to obtain informed consent would prolong the duration of the study. Are you referring to my experience in the past has been that the FDA is focused on whether consent can be obtained within the therapeutic window, within the treatment period where a patient may benefit from the intervention. And FDA has not been concerned so much on how long it takes to enroll the required number of patients.
A lot of it depends on the details of the study that you're talking about in the product. The expectation is, of course, and there's a regulatory requirement that if it's feasible to get prospective informed consent, the expectation is that informed consent will be obtained. The question really occurs when it's not feasible, of course, and whether or not the study should be approved under ethic. When we're confronted with that situation, we do, in fact, look at the time it might take to conduct the study without consent versus the time it might take to do the study with consent. But that's only part of the thought process that we put into all of this, because we also have to think about whether or not the study results, if the study were limited to consenting subjects, could be generalized to non-consenting subjects. So that's a relevant factor as well. And all of that has to be thought about sort of collectively. So in some ways, there's no easy answer.
So it depends in part on what the intended label or indication is.
Right, yeah. And if there's not much of a difference clinically with people who can give consent versus people who can't give consent, then we would expect it to be done in people who can give consent.
Yeah, that may be our easiest suit, at least for acute STEMI shock. Is there anybody on this call or webcon who would contend that patients who can give consent are the same physiology and outcomes and can be generalized to patients who can't give informed consent? I don't think anybody would have any trouble realizing that that's just not.
And that's fair enough. Of course, we'd like to see some data to support that, but yeah, I think a good reasonable argument could be made for that.
Great. Before John turns to the last group, Neil, any other nuances from our conversation that you wanted to emphasize?
Not really. I think most of the issues that were important you guys have discussed. Obviously, plenty of things left to figure out.
Thanks.
Okay, well, great. Thanks, Dave and everyone in the group. Now we'll throw it to Ileana Pina, who was in the third and last breakout session, talking about the umbrella of other stakeholders and harmonizing informed consent issues.
So after hearing all of you discuss the first two, I'm wondering if harmonization is even here yet, because there are so many, discourses that still need to be had. But I think we did have a very robust and a very excellent discussion. We talked about harmonizing, and I first introduced the business of, well, we need to harmonize with Europe, for example. Bobby Boguet, who has been taking notes, chimed in and said, certainly we need Germany, we need Denmark, but the landscape in Europe is so varied and so different. How do you pick one country and not another? And Bob out of Michigan said, how can we harmonize with them when we're not harmonized internally? So I think we all agree that the harmonization must first occur with us internally, with some basic requirements for harmonization, and that includes minimum requirements for a shock team, minimum requirements for expertise on the shock team. A central IRB seems to be, everybody really agreed, particularly with the NHLBI, and we had some industry input from Chris from Medtronic, that certainly they would be open to considering the single IRB, which would make things a lot easier. And then we came up with maybe a novel thought about, using the trauma centers as an example of when in this country, trauma was being handled so poorly in centers that did not have the expertise, and trauma certification of centers came in levels 1, 2, and 3. What about if we certified sites, not just for dealing with shock, but for being able to participate in shock trials, whatever the origin of the shock trial is, and sort of certify them from the CSRC group for being able to do the shock trials. That means that they would need to comply with certain levels of certification and renew it, because as Bobby pointed out, people move. They move from one center to another, they move into industry, they move back into a private practice setting. And there's some centers that do one type of work very beautifully and wonderfully, may not be ready to do equipoise and to randomize patients to select another methodology. So that's kind of where we came in. And when we were harmonized and we talked about harmonizing with Canada, we had Sean with us, and the Canadians don't have a regular system, but they already have their MI system in place about cath labs and patients who come in with myocardial infarction. So the basis is already there. Wouldn't it be great if we could harmonize both Canada and the United States together as a North American harmonization? And then we'd be ready to go and talk to other groups. We also mentioned Japan, that already has a relationship with the FDA. Nicole Gillette talked about that. Bobby, do you want to go over the rest of our notes here?
Liana, I think you hit on the majority. One issue that we brought up was the importance of accountability with shock trial centers, and that we're not marginalizing or underserved populations. And that as we look at certifying shock centers for clinical trials, that it's important that we look at them both in the expertise and ability to execute on the trial, but also the populations that they serve. And that not all of our trial centers are urban academic centers serving an urban population, but that we include some centers such as Mayo Clinic that serves a more rural population, and as well as centers who have a certain expertise at recruiting more women. We know women are underserved in all shock trials. But as we looked at an informed consent process, one issue when we talked about minimal requirements of a shock team is really those shock teams that have great communication with EMS or with their ED departments, that you can initiate that informed consent process when you have those good communications. So you know a shock patient's coming in, you have EMS that's in tune to the clinical trial, to the importance of initiating those discussions with family that there are clinical studies available, and that might help with the informed consent. In addition, having a shock team as part of that informed consent process gives the family the confidence and the comfort that this was a team decision. And especially if we have to do an ethic, that it's a team that made this decision, it's not one individual. And even if there's a bad outcome, there's increased confidence that a team of experts assessed their loved one and made this decision.
Yeah, and to add to that, the NHLBI brought out the excellent point that we need to make sure that we're equitable across the board and that we're servicing the populations that include the minority and the ethnicities, so that we don't favor one over the other, because it may actually backfire. It may look like we're experimenting on the more disadvantaged patients, so that we need to look at what populations are these centers serving. And I think Mayo's a good example that they're serving rural, but they're also serving urban. But other populations, some big medical centers sometimes are in very disadvantaged areas. And so we need to make sure that there's equitable distribution of what areas to serve. Anybody else who was on my group who would like to pipe in? I was very satisfied with the discussion, and I think we did hammer down some points that we'd like to make, and this is being taped. But I think central IRB, having some kind of certification at different levels even. So somebody who's a level 1 certification with CSRC can do just about any of the shock trials that would be coming through. Maybe level 2 may be able to do some where, you know, the choices are between say, you know, ECMO. If they don't do ECMO all the time, it could be a problem, and another device. So that could all be decided and stratified, but we can't harmonize outside of the United States when we are so unharmonized in the United States. John, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. You know, we set up this third breakout knowing that the concept of rolling in US and outside US is a fraught endeavor. So let me just throw up a hypothetical. Let's just say that we did intra-US have types of harmonization. Was there any discussion, and do you think taking that and harmonizing with all the other entities would be feasible, or is that just something that, you know, not in our lifetimes?
By other entities, do you mean other countries?
Other countries, yeah.
Yes.
Other countries, yeah.
We talked, for example, about Denmark and Germany that already do shock trials and that seem to have their own shock teams. We talked about Sweden that also has a global consensus. The UK would be a separate one. So I think that starting with the countries that already are ahead with the trials that they've done and that concept would be one way to do it. Certainly Japan already has a relationship with FDA. That would be another country. So I think we would have to do it as pilot projects for each of these countries, because you can't use the entire European Union. Even approval of devices is so different, as you well know, and I well know, among all the European nations. But pick our partners and test it out and see if it works.
Okay.
So one possible way to see this would be if we start with the general principles of why we've had this group ongoing over the past several years, to gather high quality data to guard the patient's rights in the process of how to overcome the limitations we've historically faced in generating randomized trials that work or can be completed, to understand how to better bring faster, better, safer devices faster to patient bedsides, to understand more about the subgroups of shock patients who have been left out rather than included in data. I don't think there's any question that in the EU, in Canada, in Japan, the fundamental principles that we're starting with reflect the whole community. whether you're manufacturing devices, regulating guardianship of promoting public health, or clinicians or patients. So I think if we start with the real principles that are driving all of our conversations, the global harmonization across the cardiovascular community, I think we could be pretty certain is a good aspiration. The devil's in the details. And I think there, the more we generate predicates that can actually move forward, and in 2021, if we can institute even some of these principles going forward, and it's timely, and I'll advertise in case anybody didn't notice that this afternoon is when the networks and safety module discussion will be going, just like this morning, into a mini think tank mode. But our goal here is, I think, to make this pragmatic. And at that level, the comment that I think Bobby made earlier out of the discussion from your group, that shock centers that have learned to rapidly identify patients who are in shock and triage, whether they're in septic shock or cardiogenic shock or whatever, who know what randomized or research trials are ongoing, are the best connection we have in conjunction with where the community of centers, clinical centers, have already gone to try and take better care of these patients. Absorbing the informed consent processes, again, as a continuum, I think she brought out a great point, which is that's a continuum for the patient or the family as well. So if the shock team that brings surgeon, cardiologist, et cetera, to your bedside is also the team that can tell you about, there's research available, we're going to give you about a 30-second encapsulation because we don't want to delay. But building that relationship and that confidence as a success story, that's up to the shock centers. And Ileana, while I love you, my dear, but the CSRC is not going to certify centers, but the CSRC is darn well a useful mechanism to put into the public domain recommended characteristics of shock centers.
Don't you think that is the beginning of harmonization internally?
Yes, and I agree 1,000%.
You just named the centers that already do this to begin to harmonize, and anybody else who wants to join needs to meet the same standards.
Right, and it makes it
by certification, I mean, review, not necessarily.
Yes, so absolutely, to allow a consensus to develop around what is a shock center, which we've been talking about for 3 years, and which has really crystallized incredibly, particularly in the past year with Alex and Alistair, as we'll join together conversations later this afternoon. I think that the needs to execute a hybrid informed consent are going to start with the ability to identify whether or not a patient can give informed consent. And if we're going to stratify randomization, somebody at the site at the front end is going to be the one who has to execute that. So that's as important as understanding whether somebody is in shock or not, if we're going to do research credibly in this area. And I think the networks groups, if they see that as also added value, de facto will accomplish that level of harmonization. And that would be a great model, I think, for a global approach.
Well, thanks, Illy. That was, and everyone in your group, very helpful to us in the larger working group. So just to sort of paraphrase, I see there are a couple comments in the chat that, when we're throwing around the term harmonization, we're talking more about sort of clinical harmonization, if you will, not that spills into regulatory harmonization with other countries, but we're talking about harmonizing the processes, as Mitch was just saying, about defining shock center's expertise, ability to define the ability for informed consent, give informed consent. So that's what we're talking about. Is that what, that's how I read it? Is that how you read it too?
That's how we read it. That's how we read it.
Okay. We're coming up on the end of the hour here, or 3 hours. Anyone else have any burning comments that they want to add?
I'd add one quick thing just as a tail end, just with regard to what Mitch mentioned. With regard to stratification, I would argue pretty strongly that any sort of stratification would need to be based on severity of shock as opposed to capacity of consent. I think we're not going to have tools that are that clean. We need to have tools that can be used to distinguish how we approach patients. But I can pretty well say to start with, there's not going to be tools from a capacity perspective that are going to be so robust from the perspective from a kind of physiologic stratification perspective. That probably ought to work the other way.
So Neil, we'll have a lot to talk about, but I will mention that one of the other aspects about having patients through an EFIC pathway who are not randomly distributed is the patients who survive ultimately may have a different level of opting out subsequently than patients who are consented before they're randomized. So there's another reason potentially to want to stratify this randomization. It doesn't mean that's instead of some other severity of shock or other key aspects for stratifying randomization, but it does mean that this may be an important one.
At least with most EFIC trials, and I know Graham mentioned this in our call too, the rate of opt-out post-inclusion is vanishingly rare. It is not a common phenomenon that people opt out of future data collection, and we don't generally have people, as we've mentioned, our regulations, if you're included under EFIC, you can't opt out of what's already been collected. So it may or may not turn out to be a huge issue from that perspective, but it's something to think about.
Okay, well, I think we're going to lose our connection here automatically, whether we want to or not. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, Nick apologizes, he got pulled away to a bit of emergency, but for him and me, it's been quite a challenge over the past year, and hearing input from folks is really clarifying for us. It may not necessarily seem that way to you folks, but I can tell you what we've heard today is really very helpful in our moving this along to tangible outputs.
So on behalf, John, of you and Nick, I will remind everybody that today is really a dive toward what we hope to consolidate and put into an even more public view during the CRT meetings next month as part of Shock 5. So I hope everybody who was so engaged today will continue to work with John and Nick between now and March to refine a lot of these things and maybe even pull some of these discussion areas together into proposals for 2021 as part of CRT.
So Mitch, we have notes that Bobby has taken, so we will forward those notes, and those could be, modified into proposals.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Anyone who wants to forward materials, I will thank Samia, Valerie, and a team of support from DCRI who have really made this Zoom platform work. And you can send it either directly to John and Nick or to Samia and Valerie Morrow, and we'll be happy to forward it to them.
Thank you.
Seamless
thanks
and
all.
done.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
See you in 60 minutes.